In the world of modern finance, we talk about big tech as if they are the most powerful entities to ever exist. We look at companies worth $2 or $3 trillion and assume we are living in the age of the ultimate megacorp. But 400 years ago, there was a company that makes modern Silicon Valley look like a small-town grocery store. They didn't just have customers, they had subjects. They didn't just have a board of directors, they had a private army. They didn't just trade goods, they conquered nations, executed their own employees for minor offenses, and quite literally invented the concept of the stock market. This was the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, better known as the VOC, or the Dutch East India Company. At its absolute peak, this single corporation was worth the modern equivalent of nearly $8 trillion. To put that in perspective, that is more than the value of Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, and Meta combined. This is the dark, true story of the world's first trillion-dollar megacorp, the company that was too big to fail until it finally did. The story begins in the year 1602. At the time, the world was obsessed with one thing: spices. Nutmeg, cloves, and pepper were the oil of the 17th century. A single ship returning from the East Indies with a hull full of spices could turn a peasant into a millionaire overnight, but the journey was a suicide mission. Half of the ships that left Europe never returned. They were lost to storms, scurvy, or pirates. For a single merchant, the risk was too high. So the Dutch government did something radical. They granted a group of competing merchants a 21-year monopoly on all Dutch trade in Asia. They created a single unified entity, the VOC. But to fund this massive operation, they needed a revolutionary amount of capital. So they did something that had never been done in human history. They invited the public to invest. Anyone in Amsterdam, from wealthy merchants to domestic servants, could buy a piece of the company. In exchange for their cash, they were given a certificate representing a share of the profits. With that single act, the Dutch East India Company invented the initial public offering and the first stock exchange in history. The company was flooded with cash, and they used it to build a corporate machine the likes of which the world had never seen. The VOC was not just a trading firm. It was a sovereign state in the form of a business. They were granted the legal right to build forts, to coin their own money, and to declare war. They operated a private fleet of nearly 5,000 ships and maintained a private army of 10,000 professional soldiers. If a local ruler in the Spice Islands refused to give them a monopoly, the VOC didn't negotiate. They invaded. They wiped out entire populations to ensure that not a single bag of nutmeg left the islands without their seal on it. Inside the company, the discipline was just as brutal. The VOC was a machine designed for one purpose: shareholder value. If an employee was caught smuggling, which usually just meant trying to sell a few handfuls of cloves on the side, the penalty was death. They policed their monopoly with an iron fist, burning down any spice trees that grew outside of their controlled zones to keep supply low and prices high. For over a century, the VOC was invincible. They paid out an average annual dividend of 18% for nearly 200 years. It was the most successful investment in history. But beneath the surface, the golden age was rotting. The company had a fatal flaw that modern corporations still struggle with today: corruption and short-term thinking. Because the VOC was so powerful, its officials in Asia became untouchable. They began running their own private businesses on the side, stealing from the company on a massive scale. At the same time, the board of directors back in Amsterdam, the Heren 17, became obsessed with keeping the dividends high to please the stockholders. Even when the company started losing money due to expensive wars and rising competition from the British, they refused to cut the payouts. To keep the shareholders happy, the VOC began borrowing massive amounts of money just to pay out dividends. They were essentially running a state-sponsored Ponzi scheme. By the late 1700s, the world's first megacorp was drowning in debt. The end came swiftly. In 1799, The company that had once owned the world was formally dissolved. The Dutch government took over its remaining territories and its mountain of debt. The VOC had collapsed under the weight of its own greed, its own corruption, and the impossible demand for infinite growth. The VOC reminds us that the line between a corporation and a government is thinner than we think. They prove that a company can become so powerful that it can rewrite the laws of the world. But even an $8 trillion empire can't rewrite the laws of math. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the billionaires who broke history, hit the like button, subscribe to join the archive. See you in the next one.